In episode 5, I brought up the topic of how if our ideas about who we are and what it takes to make us happy are too rigid, that sooner or later we're going to have difficulty when reality and our lives don't match up to the images that we have. That brought to mind a movie that I saw not long ago. A very good movie called The Sea Inside. It's a Spanish movie. And it's based on the true story of a guy who lived in Spain up until just recently. He had dived into a shallow pool in the ocean. I think he was in his 20s. He broke his neck and became paralyzed from the neck down. He had spent most of his life since that time, and I think at the time the movie was portraying, he was in his 60s maybe, and he had spent the time since then trying to find a way to end his life. Nobody in his family was willing to do it, and it's against the law in Spain, and there was some sort of association or society that was in favor of persons being able to do that he'd gotten in contact with or become involved with. They wanted to help him, but at the same time, they couldn't do anything about the Spanish law. They didn't want to end up in jail. He spent much of his life trying to get the law changed so that he could end his life. The reason, of course, which was very clear in the movie, was that he had an idea about himself, and it was no longer in keeping with reality. He was paralyzed, and he had been a vigorous person and a sailor. He had seen a good bit of the world, and he had to give up that life and was confined in bed. He had known the love of the fair sex, the women, and enjoyed it like a lot of us guys do, and there were no prospects of that in the future. So his life had become so different that he no longer wanted to carry on. And one of the things that was interesting about his attitude as portrayed in the movie and the attitude of the director, which was the same, and there was a very interesting special feature on the DVD involving the director, and the idea of death as an event at which one ceases to be. There's no afterlife. It is exactly the same way that I view death. I believe that for me, when I die, it will be just like turning out a light. Everything that I have ever experienced or thought about or done will just disappear as if it had never happened. The end. No wandering about the void forever. None of the unpleasantness, or some people have imagined what they think might be a pleasant afterlife. I don't believe in any of those, and I think, like the people in the movie, that if you're unhappy with your life, and if you do not wish to alter your expectations of life, or your image of life, or what it is that's worthwhile in life to be and experience, if you are set on being a certain way, and that way is not possible, and the divergence is so great that you would rather not continue, then I think everyone should have the right to just turn it off. In his case, he had difficulty doing it himself. He eventually found people that would help him. Actually took video of himself drinking a liquid that terminated his life on camera. It was very profound. The whole movie was very well done. Tremendous acting and direction. It was well worth seeing. Well, all of us are going to face that in some way, perhaps not that extreme a way as being paralyzed, but as I said in episode 5, if we live long enough, then our bodies are going to be altered and our image of ourselves is going to be altered. Now, I've seen it in My father, he's had some struggles with it. He enjoyed his working life. He enjoyed a lot of positive feedback, respect, and appreciation for his abilities and the things that he was able to do. When he retired, he no longer had that outlet of performing those functions at work, but he still had his basic abilities, and they called on him on occasion to do consultation and to help them out after he retired, which he enjoyed tremendously. But one of the things that he did in his professional career and in home life was he's an incredible handyman, and he could make things work that couldn't be made to work otherwise, and invented things to work. Back in World War II, he invented a furnace that burned used motor oil. I'm sure it was pretty polluting, but it did provide heat. It worked. Since you couldn't get heating oil of any other kind, it was a major accomplishment for him, which he didn't capitalize on anyway. It was something that he did for the welfare of the family. But he did that sort of thing all his life. And as he got older, he found he could no longer do those things. And I have seen him struggling with becoming a different person, losing his abilities as time has gone by, his physical abilities, and his mental acuity is not what it was. And he's well aware of that. Of both those things. I have seen him struggle with that, and so I know that it's something that we will all face if we live long enough. And myself, I have had, in the past few months, some rather radical alterations in my own view of myself, not just the vertigo, but as some of you who've listened to earlier episodes know already, I was quite involved in my sexuality at a younger age, and I was quite identified with being a sexually active person. When I got clean and sober, as we say, or had my nervous breakdown, as a friend said, and became convinced that everything I knew was wrong, one of the things that I came to believe was wrong was that my attitude toward women, regardless of the fact that, as I said in episode 2, I had come to regard my behavior as mechanistic and unpalatable in that regard. But in another way, I saw that I had caused people emotional discomfort and pain. I had always tried to prepare them for that because I knew that. Well, I'll tell you the story. I had this routine that I went through with women where I would tell them that the way I was with women was the same way that I was with record albums, in that I would buy a new one and I would play it over and over and over, and I would learn a lot of the songs, and it would be the only thing I would listen to for a while. But sooner or later, I would either get another new album, or I would start playing some of my older albums, and the new album would drift into the stack and take its place along with all the other older albums that I had learned thoroughly. That may not convey the true sense of my relationship with women, in that I did have some long-term relationships that lasted quite some time. I didn't have the variety. I didn't have the extensive variety of sexual partners that some of our professional athletes have had in recent times. But I did not see myself as the kind of person who settled down with one woman and spent the rest of my life with her. Although even at that time I had been married twice. At the time I got married, I always knew that I had the option of getting out at any time that I decided I had had enough. My first marriage, the divorce was final a couple of weeks before our first anniversary. The second one lasted several years. It eventually was over. And in fact, during that one of the unpleasant memories is that I promoted open marriage against my wife's wishes. That's really part of why the relationship lasted as long as it did, I think, was that I wasn't totally deprived of variety. But, as I say, when I got clean and sober, I realized that despite my warning people that they would likely come to be unhappy with their future status, that didn't prevent their getting involved. When the truth of what I had said was borne out, they were disappointed because when love was new, I did act and feel very much as if they were the only person in the world, and I enjoyed them thoroughly, and I cared about them, and I continue to care about them. That was not an issue. But my caring was not the kind that would lead to an exclusive relationship. It was caring of an intensity that would convince most women that it would lead to a long-term relationship. So inevitably, they developed expectations and were then disappointed. I realized when I got sober that that sort of behavior was not good for me, that I had been, besides not being good for them, I had allowed myself to believe that I was not doing any harm, or that the harm that I was doing I had made sufficient advance warning of, that I couldn't be held accountable for it. And I came to the conclusion that if I caused people harm, psychological discomfort, then I was responsible for that, even if I had warned them that it would happen. And so I could no longer countenance that behavior on that ground, in addition to the fact that it was mechanistic. Mechanistic in terms of being driven primarily by evolutionary forces. I was faced, although I wasn't conscious, it's only been really years later that I realized the dynamic. But I was faced with the option of either giving up sex altogether or learning to have exclusive relationships with women long term. In other words, committing to someone and making it a lifelong commitment, and that would be the way that I could have sex without causing people harm, that would be a better way of living than the way I had lived before. Well, the truth is, as it turned out, that in spite of my good intentions, I did not really enjoy the kind of relationship that was involved in lifelong commitment. I'm too much a hermit. I too much like to be by myself. I can find roots of that preference in my life history. I can see the origins going back to a very young age. In spite of the fact that I may have some understanding of it in terms of the causes and its evolution, nonetheless, it has not altered the fact that when I am around other people, I do not feel as comfortable as I do when I'm by myself. I do not feel as free and unfettered. Really, some of the things that I think contributed to it are just total societal programming. I mean, I was a young fellow when Playboy magazine was a big deal. I developed that as an ideal. That was the image of myself that I had, the image of what happiness in life was to be someone who was totally free and unfettered and enjoyed the fruits of the vine, of all the various vines of life, freely, without involvement or difficulties. Growing up in America, there's the whole cowboy ethic, living out on the range and being a free, unfettered spirit. There's a whole stereotype of that sort of lifestyle, the adventurer, the explorer, that I bought into. As clearly as I can see that now, it doesn't alter the fact that that's the way I enjoy being. I like to be by myself. The marriages didn't work out. I wish I could have had the same clarity about what my preferences are and how I want to live from the beginning. Then, when I was getting married the second 2 times, as I have now, I think one of the difficulties in having that kind of clarity is that clarity means that I have to give up sex in all but the most hedonistic environments. There used to be a place in San Francisco back before AIDS called the Sutro Bathhouse. And of course, there have been bathhouses in San Francisco for a long time, but that particular bathhouse didn't cater exclusively to gay men the way most of them have. And in fact, their motto was a rainbow of sexual preferences. So you could find just about any sort of sexual preference or gender bending sort of phenomenon there as anywhere. I mean, I encountered transvestites, transsexuals, and quite a few married people who were just out for a sexual adventure. So in that kind of environment, I could have sex, but that became less appealing once AIDS appeared on the scene. And fortunately, I was out of the action for a few years. I got sober early enough that I withdrew from that whole scene. In fact, I moved to Arizona, and as far as I know, there wasn't any establishment like that, although I'm sure there were certain activities along that line. But at any rate, I was out of that kind of environment when things got really ugly with AIDS. I think still it doesn't have the appeal that it once did when things were much more lighthearted. The situation I encountered when I moved out on my own from my most recent marriage was that in spite of the wonders of the internet, the ability to approach a large number of people with your interests and proclivities, that in fact, if I were totally honest with people about my own proclivities, not many women are particularly interested. I mean, the younger women who are still into sexual adventure and haven't quite got to the point of realizing that, hey, it's time to choose and reproduce or the opportunity will be passed. They're not interested in a guy my age. I don't care how good a shape I'm in or how attractive I might be. Well, now if I had more money, perhaps. But I'm not a rich guy. I'm comfortable. And the women my age are pretty much done with that phase of their life. And what they're interested in is someone to share the golden years. Well, if that were my proclivity, I wouldn't be out here in the world. I'd still be with my last wife, because as far as companions for the golden years, I really couldn't ask for much more. But I don't want to be a companion. I don't want to be anyone's companion for the golden years. I don't want to share my life with anyone. I don't really feel the need to share my life with anyone. Given all that, I've come to the conclusion that the only way I could have sex with anyone in my current circumstances would be to be dishonest about what my interests are, what my predilections are, what I want in life. So I'm left with a choice of being honest or not having sex. And I have to choose honesty. So it's it's been a strange experience for this formerly aspiring playboy to come to grips with the idea that I will probably not have sex with another human being for the rest of my life unless something very strange and radical happens. So that is the image of myself and what life is that I have come to accept. On another level, I don't want to be limited in my pursuit of the truth. That, of course, is a whole other subject. In the tape I made 22 years ago that I played on episode 2, in that tape I talked about having a long-term desire to be free. And I was coming to the conclusion that freedom in the sense that I had imagined was not possible. I had an untenable fantasy when one faces the reality of the human condition and how the brain works and scientific reality. I had a fantasy of life that was incompatible with reality, with the truth as I came to see it. The idea that there could be something in my head that could act independently of prior influences is really incoherent when you look at it logically, and it's certainly when you look at it neurophysiologically, it's not going to happen. It's not a real possibility. Given that I had that kind of aspiration for most of my life, what was left afterwards is another aspiration. That is, if I can't be free in the sense that I wanted, let me at least be as free of illusion as possible. Let me be as in touch with the reality of my situation as a human being as I can be. It turns out that the reality of our situation is different from what most people imagine when they think about determinism, when they come to the realization that determinism means that there is no thought or feeling that doesn't have its origins in our physiology and our history, that everything we experience is a result of everything that has gone before, and that we are inextricably bound up with the rest of reality. The reality of our situation is not as grim as it seemed to me at first blush. For one thing, it's a wonderful gift that the number of things that we can be conscious of at any one time is limited, because it means that we can't really be aware of all the precedents in our life and how they're going to play out in the present moment. Life is full of surprises. An analogy I've used is that the physics of sunsets is very clearly understood. What makes for the colors in the sunset and what sorts of conditions affect cloud formations, the refraction of light, all the phenomena that are involved in sunset are fairly well understood, although they can't be predicted on a micro level, chaos being what it is. There's nothing supernatural, there's no strange physics involved in sunset. And yet, for many of us, we can watch how the details of any particular sunset play out with fascination because there is such variety, such possibility of surprise. And that's the way it is with really everything in our life. Even though we may clearly realize that everything that happens flows out of prior circumstances, that doesn't make us any more able to predict what our next thought will be, or our next inclination will be, or anyone else's. And so life continues to be interesting as a thing that is unpredictable, as a source of surprise and wonder, in spite of the fact that it's governed just as much by the laws of physics and chemistry as the sunset is. So given that life is full of surprises and is still very much an experience to be relished and enjoyed and awestruck by, one of the things that makes it particularly exciting and interesting to me is the possibility of seeing it more clearly, of seeing through the illusions that have evolved as part of our living in society, seeing through those illusions, seeing those illusions clearly, learning to experience life in a more open way, a less conceptually inhibited way. But that aspiration, that desire to experience life in that way, means that if I have obligations to another human being, I have to consider them and the possible consequences to them if I should come to the point of deciding, of realizing that there is some aspect of the way that I look at the world that I want to divest myself of. I have to think about how that's going to impact another human being. It makes the whole enterprise more involved and complicated and less open. There's a somewhat mythological story from Zen that I can tell, maybe clarify my thinking here. There was this character called Upagupta, and he was a totally realized being in the early lineages of Zen. A man came to him one day and wanted to be his follower and be initiated. And Upagupta says, well, the requirements are that you have to believe what I say and you have to do whatever I say. And the guy says, well, that's why I'm here. I'm ready. So at that point, Upagupta materialized this mountain with trees hanging off the side, this precipitous peak, a huge chasm below. He told this guy to climb up in one of the trees, which he did. And Upagupta said, okay, now let go your foothold. So the guy did. Upagupta said, now let go with one of your hands. And the guy did. Upagupta said, let go with your other hand. And the guy says, but if I let go with the other hand, I'll fall into the abyss and be killed. And Upagupta says, well, you said you were going to do whatever I say. Can you imagine if, at this point, the guy had said, well, okay, but can I call my wife first? Well, that's not what happened in the story. In the story, he let go. He let go, as they say, of his body and his life. By that, I take it to mean that he let go of his prior conceptions of his body and his life, his image of himself, his illusions about who he was, and was able as a result to see the world more clearly. So, that's my aspiration. I would like to see the world as clearly as possible. I feel that I am freer and that I have more options if I'm not obligated to another human being. So, here I am. There are ups and downs. There is a certain appeal to the idea of having someone in your life that you can depend on, and that if you get sick, if you get a serious case of vertigo, this person would care about you and take care of you and make sure that nothing extremely bad happened to you. And there's an appeal to that. It's very nice, but there's really nothing you can count on. I mean, suppose I had someone like that and they died, which happens. And this person that I had counted on was no longer there. Of course, you could say, well, I had them while they were alive, and that's better than not having them at all, but that's not the way it looks to me. There's a Zen saying that there's nothing you can depend on. Ultimately, I think that's true. I would like to learn, in any case, how to live with the possibility that everyone that I know, everyone who cares about me, could die, and I would be left alone, coping the best I could. I have accepted that as a challenge at this point in my life. We'll all have to stick around to see how it works out in the long run.